Right, picking up with the Berlin blockade, this was the first major crisis of the Civil War. In June, the Russians had decided to blockade Berlin. Russia did not respond to Western attempts at containment, to test or resolve. To NATO was their basic response to these containment ideas and this upping of military spending and personnel. Stalin decided to cut off all traffic going into Berlin. The capital of Germany, Berlin, was inside the Soviet occupation zone. And so basically leaves Truman with a couple of options. He can either back out and lose the city, or he can send in reinforcements and wait it out. And so, of course, coming up with a re-election, he decides to take a more active stance with it. Two-phase policy. Phase one was a massive airlift of food, fuel, and supplies. Several different planes made round trips, carrying about 2,500 tons every 24 hours. Phase two was to not only increase the amount of supplies that were put into Berlin or brought into Berlin from 4,000 up to 7,000 tons a day, but also to support that enforcement with 60 B-29 bombers, American bombers that went into bases in England. Those were the planes that could hold the atomic bombs, so it made the Soviets a little bit tense. We're going to continue all of this until Russia decides to end the blockade about 11 months after they'd begun, and decided to open up the highways to Berlin. U.S. saw this as a big political victory. There's going to be a long-term division, however, with Germany, but we see this as kind of the end of phase one of the Cold War. It's the triumph of American ingenuity over Russian stubbornness. The Cold War has cut Europe pretty much in two, divided by what Churchill called the Iron Curtain. Western Europe starts to be revitalized, Eastern Europe not so much. Cold War is going to expand to an arms race. Both sides begin to rebuild their forces with new methods, new weapons. The conflict is going to expand into Asia. For the military to go along with these new policies, we have the National Security Act. It's going to have a cabinet-level secretary to preside over the Army, Navy, and Air Force, create government agencies. It's going to the Department of Defense has that civilian-level secretary. Also creates the CIA to coordinate intelligence gathering, and also the NSC, the National Security Council, to advise the president. It's going to be composed of Secretary of Defense, and State, and advise on all matters of national security. The defense budget was devoted pretty much to the Air Force because they had the capability of atomic bombing. And no longer does the U.S. have a monopoly over the atom bomb technology once Russia has their first successful test. And so Truman is going to want to have supremacy in terms of nuclear war power, and so we start to develop the hydrogen bomb. A lot of people oppose it on moral grounds because it was 1,000 times greater than the atom bomb. George Kennan, the guy who came up with the containment idea, suggested arms control talks with the USSR would be better, but he will resign in protest after his suggestion was rejected. The NSC 68 statement was passed. It was a new statement on the national defense policy, so the Soviet Union meant to impose its authority on the rest of the world, and was a challenge to the U.S. and planned for world domination. So it led to a massive expansion of our military power and a huge increase on our defense budget. The U.S. Was going to end up spending 50% of the gross national product on defense. In Asia, the U.S. is going to consolidate its hold on Japan and all former Japanese holdings in the Pacific. The Yalta Conference had produced a balance of power agreement. U.S. dominated northeastern Asia. U.S. dominated the Pacific and former Japanese Empire. MacArthur and the U.S. prevent and deny Soviet Union from any role in the Japanese reconstruction. They rely on us for their security. Also helped to bring in a new Japanese government that was a constitutional democracy, banning any communist participation. MacArthur declared the Pacific an Anglo-Saxon lake. Josiah Strong, the Our Country idea, he would have been very excited about all of that. U.S. is going to conduct atomic bomb tests in this region, however. In China, China was in between the U.S. and Soviet spheres. After the war, the country is torn between the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, or now known as Mao Zedong, the communists. Alright, communist forces in China were trying to take over, and we were supporting the nationalists in the south, but Chiang Kai-shek's administration was plagued by inflation and corruption, which weakened his position in the government with the people. Mao appealed to discipline and patriotism and wins over the lower class votes. America tried to prevent a Chinese civil war and made a failed attempt at forming a coalition government between the two factions. Chiang Kai-shek hoped to seize Manchuria and to get rid of the communists. Mao plays into effect. U.S. will send over supplies, but ultimately Mao will force out Chiang Kai-shek and the U.S. forces and take over China. We will refuse to recognize them as the legitimate government there. China was considered to have fallen to the communists. State Department was blamed. Republicans are going to blame the Democrats and the government for letting it fall and really start to make a comeback with some of that. Mao and Stalin sign a treaty of assistance with each other, and America is going to end up focusing on Japan as its main Asian alliance after the loss of China, building up bases, making American-Japanese security pacts, and declaring that the government in China was a colonial Russian government. So Asia is now split by the Cold War as well. In Korea, the communist forces were trying to invade into the nationalist forces in South Korea. Korea had been split in the 30th parallel since 1945, and this is 1950. The northern part was industrial and communist. The southern part was agrarian and nationalist, and there's going to be a face-off between them. The North Koreans are getting approval from Stalin and Mao, reminding people of the aggression of Hitler and Mussolini. UN's going to call for elections to reunify the country. Both sides ignore that. Soviet Union had left a very large, well-trained North Korean army in place. U.S. Feared that they would have a forced reoccupation in South Korea. And so Truman's going to make South Korea's defense a UN effort, sending in troops. North Korea had crossed the 38th parallel line, and so South Korea is asking the United Nations for help, calling for collective security. Communists are going to seriously underestimate the U.S. response in this, and the U.S. is going to join a 3-year police action in Korea. Major action was to push them back, stop the invasion. We do accomplish pushing them back to the original 30th parallel line, but Truman has a new idea that they wanted to unify Korea with military force. Americans ignore the warnings from China about invading into North Korea. Truman's advisor said nothing would likely come of those threats, but they were wrong. So Truman has a counterattack pushing Americans back out of North Korea, and the war is going to end in a stalemate. Truman's very upset with how MacArthur had handled the whole anti-UN strategies and ends up firing him during the process. Truman does achieve his original goal, defending South Korea and collective security. There is no treaty, just a ceasefire and stopping the North Koreans coming into the South. MacArthur in the process tried unification, confusing the public, humiliating the United States, and ending up getting himself fired. The biggest significance out of this was a massive American rearmament. Army comes back up to about $3.5 million and defense budget at $50 billion, and also foreign bases from Saudi Arabia to Morocco. All right, at home, the Cold War, we have New Deal economic policies undermined by the fact that we have a lot of things going on in foreign policy, so very little can get done and accomplished on our domestic policy. We have fear of communist subversion, and the Republicans are going to start to come back with and revive their political party. Obstacles for Truman: besides being relatively unknown, he did have two weaknesses: a fondness for appointing his old friends to positions, and also a lack of political vision. He was caught between consumers and unions, couldn't please either one of them. He had an apathetic public. They were tired of having shortages and sacrifice. And there's an inflation, and prices go up 25% in 2 years. Workers wanted higher wages to offset no overtime pay. There's some labor unrest, 2 big strikes in 1946, a walkout by coal miners, which threatened U.S. industry, and also a paralyzing strike by railroad workers. Republicans are going to win the Congress majority in the midterm elections in 46, take advantage of the wartime frustrations and campaign against Truman. Said to err is Truman. Coming up for his re-election, people thought that there's no way that Truman could get elected, that he was certain to lose. Dewey thought it was so confident he really didn't have much of a campaign. Southern Democrats and Northern Liberals are going to lead the party, which made people convinced even more that his time in office was over. Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, leave, but what stays is the old Roosevelt coalition, those who supported FDR, farmers, organized labor, urban ethnic groups, African Americans held together, and will get Truman the re-election against the do-nothing Congress that they had in place. Republicans, as a response, are going to challenge how Truman handles the Cold War. You really can't challenge him on his stance on the Cold War, since he is against the aggression of the Soviet Union. He is for containment. You can't argue those principles, but you can object to how he handles the situations in the Cold War. Oops. For communism, there's another Red Scare. People were afraid that communist Russia was going to be the successor of Nazi Germany, a totalitarian police state that will threaten the basic liberties of free people. Truman administration was going to conduct a campaign against these subversives. 1946, we have a loyalty program that led to security checks in the government employees, rooting out if they had any reasonable grounds for being disloyal. Thousands lost their job. There's going to be several trials. The Pumpkin Papers, Alger Hiss finding microfilms and confidential government documents in his possession. He goes to prison for being a spy. There's 11 communists tried and convicted of subversion in 1948. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were put on trial for conspiracy to transmit the atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, but they plead their innocence, are found guilty, and electrocuted. Democrats are going to get the blame for losing China to communism and also for Russia developing the hydrogen bomb. Marks the end of American monopoly of the atom bomb and blame it on Soviet espionage. So there's new bursts of hysteria, fear of Russia, fear of espionage, belief of the unseen conspiracy. The face of the second Red Scare is Senator Joseph McCarthy, his anti-communism campaign. He always seemed to have a list. He wanted to hunt down any alleged communists in the government. The innocent were overwhelmed by accusations, intimidating people at the highest level of government. He was very popular for a long time. Failed to unearth a single confirmed communist in the government, but the secret to success wasn't research and evidence, but more fear. He attacks privileged bureaucrats, supported by the Midwestern Republicans, the Irish, the Italian, the Polish workers. When he attacks the army, however, he will be censored in 1954 and ends up dying in 57. Eisenhower comes in after Truman served his second term. He's very popular. He's got the experience from World War II. Behind him, he's also a very gifted politician and diplomat. He's going to use the frustration to get the presidency, the stalemate in Korea, the Red Scare, and he's able to unite the nation coming in 52. In 53, he signs a stalemate, accepting an early and honorable end to the war. Stalin's death also hastens an end to the Korean conflict in 1953. Eisenhower is going to deal pretty passively with McCarthy. Instead of toning down the witch hunt, McCarthy went too far and attacked sections of the U.S. Army. Eisenhower dealt with him with what was called the hidden hand. McCarthy had been televised. He was rude. People said he had no decency and public humiliation of people. He appeared as a crude, out-of-control bully, and so the Senate is going to censor him in 1954, and his power is pretty much done, and he will actually pass away not too much later. His influence, though, was profound, causing political and cultural conformity, requiring loyalty oaths from teachers, banning books, blacklisting entertainers in radio, TV, film. People are ready for a change, though. Eisenhower is going to relax tensions with Russia. He comes in, he was well prepared, long military history, a good politician. He comes in, his Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles. Dulles made daily speeches, took a hard line against conservatives. Eisenhower still makes all major decisions. He was worried about budget deficits and military-industrial complex. The debt imposed by defense spending had increased $13 billion from $13 billion to $50 billion under Truman, and we were in danger of going bankrupt. It did favor the Air Force. The possibility of atomic warfare also made him a little nervous and wants to relax the tensions, and so wants to end the arms race and begin efforts to disarm with Russia. In Indochina, also known as Vietnam, Eisenhower had been providing or refuses military aid for the French retention. We had been providing aid against the communist guerrillas led by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. U.S. will agree to help if England does, and they refuse. Joint Chief of Staff will suggest that we have a decisive air attack. Eisenhower says, no, I don't think that's a good idea, so instead we're going to get involved in a lengthy ground conflict. Dien Bien Phu falls to the communists, and the victory of communist Ho Chi Minh prompts the intervention Ho Chi Minh gets northern Vietnam. French have the southern divided on the 17th parallel, promised to elect to unify the country in 2 years. Never done, mostly because Eisenhower fears